This summer, be part of something historic. Idaho Access Project is celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act with Hands Around the Capitol. This powerful event will take place on Friday, July 25th at Cecil D. Andrus Park from 11 to 4. We'll be making history as the only state with 1,000 people joining hands and encircling our Capitol building in support and solidarity for disability rights. Plus, there will be live entertainment, interactive exhibits, and over 60 booths. Find out more at idahoaccessproject.org. Today on CityCast, Boise, we're digging into a new U.S. Senate campaign to find out if an independent candidate can shake up Idaho's political landscape. And the legislature has limited Boise's ability to use red light cameras even as traffic deaths climb. Plus, we've got juicy local picks, fresh veggies from Peaceful Belly, and a new book celebrating our state's most influential women. It's Friday, July 18th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Happy Friday again, everyone. And joining me to break down this week's biggest stories is political scientist Charlie Hunt. Thank you so much for being here today, Charlie.
Happy as always to join, Lindsay.
There are so many stories this week, and I'm so glad we have you because there are some very politically based stories. But before we get into those, I just wanted to note that this show is sponsored by Visit Walla Walla.
I am always happy to visit Walla Walla, so let's get into it.
One of the top stories this week, and kind of for the past 7 to 10 days, has been Todd Achilles. And he's he was a Democratic rep out of District 16. He was in the legislature this last session, and he'd been appointed for part of the previous session. And then news broke recently that he's no longer a Dem. He's identifying as an independent, and he's making a run for the Senate against Senator Risch. But there seems to be a lot of friction in this announcement. It seems like some groups aren't happy. The Idaho Dems talked about this. The Idaho Queer Caucus has talked about this. And it touches on a lot of things that are, I feel like, kind of bubbling up in our society right now. Third parties. Do Democrats and Republicans represent the people? What's going on with our political system? Is there enough traction where a third-party candidate could win? What does this mean if Dems in Idaho are becoming independents? I have so many questions, Charlie. So what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to dig into here. So first, we should note right off the bat that Idaho voters have not elected a non-Republican U.S. senator since 1974. So more than 50 years we have gone without electing a U.S. senator who isn't a Republican. No secret here that Idaho is a really red state. I don't know if you've heard. And so, what Achilles is doing here is something that other candidates have attempted to do over the last few election cycles, which is to sort of acknowledge the fact that, okay, we're in a red state, a Democrat, someone who identifies as a Democrat just is not likely to win statewide. Mm-hmm. That's just the truth. And so what we've seen in states like Nebraska, we saw this last year, and in 2022 in Utah, which was you had candidates running as independents, but with the kind of ostensible support of the Democratic Party, who then chose not to field a candidate. And so we saw this last year in 2024 in Nebraska, where Dan Osborne ran as an independent. This guy was not progressive by any means, and he wasn't a Democrat, but the Democratic Party basically opted to endorse him instead of running a candidate under the Democratic Party banner. Utah did the same thing in 2022 with Evan McMullen, who used to be a presidential candidate, but basically ran in an alliance with the Democrats, but as an independent. So as, I think the idea is not to scare away potentially independent or kind of independent-leaning Republican voters who might be inclined to vote for an independent, but who probably just couldn't stomach voting for a Democrat. And so it is an interesting strategy, and probably the only one that is likely to or could have any kind of a shot of defeating a long-term incumbent like Jim Risch.
There hasn't been a lot of clarification on why Todd wanted to go to independent, if this was some kind of a strategy or some kind of a way to leverage, like you mentioned in these other races. And I invited him on the show a couple times, haven't heard back, went to his campaign website. No solid policy stances yet, nothing outside of, Dems and Republicans aren't really working for the people, or there's disgust with both parties. And I mean, he's not wrong with that. There was a recent survey by The Economist in a YouGov poll that found 55% of people disapprove of President Trump. GOP disapproval is 52%. Democrat disapproval is 60%. People overall don't seem to be happy with Trump, the Republicans, or the Democrats. But I also don't necessarily think that means there's a lot of room for a third party candidate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a super important point, Lindsay, especially when we zero in on Idaho. So last year, the Idaho Public Policy Survey, which was put out by Boise State and the School of Public Service, the party breakdown of the state was 15% Democrat, 38% Independent, and 43% Republican. And so, you might look at that and say, wow, if I'm running statewide, I'm probably going to be much better off as an independent, since clearly there aren't many Idahoan Democrats, right? And this makes sense, except that if you look at those 38% who say that they're independent, nearly 2/3 of those folks, when you ask a follow-up, say they lean towards one party or the other, right? And so what you end up with are actually only about 15 or 16% of the state who are what we would call sort of pure independents, who really do refuse to affiliate with one party or the other. And the other problem is that of those leaners, the independents who actually tend to lean towards one party or the other, way more of them in Idaho lean towards the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And they tend to vote a lot like regular Republicans, right? So most of them voted for Donald Trump last year. That doesn't mean that none of these Republican leaners can be picked off or that a win is impossible, but it does mean, right, you need basically, if you're Todd Achilles, you need basically everybody in the state who is not a diehard Trump affiliating Republican. And, he's, like we said, he's going to have a better shot at that as an independent than as a Democrat. But that also means, to your point about the friction with the Democrats, it means you need every Democrat. And so maybe some of the issues there are things that he's going to need to address.
And I think that is what I think might be the biggest issue for him, or potentially one of the biggest hurdles to overcome, is that, I've talked to several Dem insiders, and word on the street is they asked him to leave the party. They asked him to vacate his seat, that, this, and it wasn't necessarily on the best of terms. And then we had the Idaho Young Dems coming out. Well, there was an influencer who made a video in support of Todd Achilles on Instagram, and the Idaho Young Dems came out and talked about his voting record and how there were issues with it that they had concerns about. Members of the Idaho Queer Caucus came out and said the same thing. And so it doesn't seem like at this moment he's got that full, robust Dem support that you mentioned he absolutely needs.
Yeah, and I think this sort of draws out a couple of key differences between his situation and some of these other situations that I talked about earlier. So, in Nebraska last year, Dan Osborne, he was never political at all before he ran. Like, he was just sort of like a union guy who decided to get involved in politics. And so he had some credibility there. And in Utah, Evan McMullen, in 2022, he used to be a Republican, right? And so he maybe had even more credibility. And so the alliance with the Democrats was like, wow, like if these folks are working together, then maybe this is saying something significant about our political system and maybe we should support. And neither of those guys won, but they got way more of the vote than any Democrat had in either of those states. And Achilles, right, he was a Democrat just a few weeks ago, and in his announcement and in some of the language he's used since then, he's had some pretty strong words for the Democrats and has basically implied, right, that both sides are the problem here. What he said was, quote, "The two-party system is failing no matter who's in power." And I can imagine Democrats maybe looking at this in the Trump era and feeling maybe like this is a little bit of a false equivalence that he's drawing and thinking, well, is this really our guy? Especially to your point, given some of the controversial votes he took during the last legislative session.
I mean, Risch is not beloved. And I've seen a lot of, when people are talking about Todd Achilles and about this election, a lot of, we need anyone but Risch. We dislike Risch. Risch isn't standing up for Idahoans. I mean, we saw with the big, beautiful bill, Idaho did not get exemptions. From my own perspective, I don't feel like he really put much on the line for Idaho. He fell in line. He, did what he was told. And I'm curious your thoughts. Do you think that there is enough dislike, distrust, overall disapproval of Senator Risch that could carry Todd into his seat? Like, is that a strong enough of a feeling to get people to vote for an independent candidate?
I'm happy to eat my words, 18 months from now, but the answer is no. I don't think Risch is uniquely disliked among the Republican delegation in the same way that, like, we've seen, for example, in Texas, Ted Cruz has had some really tough re-election fights in a state that's like Texas that's pretty red. That's because Ted Cruz is super unpopular basically everywhere. Sorry, Ted Cruz. But like Jim Risch is not, like, I have the feeling most Idahoans couldn't pick him out of a lineup. And I don't mean that as an insult to him, but just like, he's not the most high profile U.S. senator. He's not super controversial. And so the party ID, right, the party label is just going to take him really far. And so it does lead me to wonder, would it have been a better strategy to switch parties to the Republican Party and then run in the primary, right? That's a different route you could take and that other people have taken. And so, no, I mean, I think it's, if you're on the left, it's worth trying, right? But I'm not sure, especially if Achilles can't necessarily situate himself in a way that's really broadly appealing, that this is necessarily going to work.
And that was my concern when I didn't see any policy stances where, I mean, it's pretty easy for anyone, if you're going out for a beer or talking to anyone to be like, I don't like the Dems, I don't like the Republicans, I don't think anybody represents me. But you do need maybe more if you're going to have a shot at winning an election. And maybe at some point we will have those policy stances, but right now it's hard to speak to those. I do want to say, because his seat is vacated, the governor will be appointing another representative from District 16. And so the District 16 Democrat Committee was soliciting names of people who lived in the district for a year, were registered Democrats. And at some point before the session, Governor Little will pick from a list of 3, I believe, for someone to fill that seat. So right now I haven't heard anything about who that list of 3 is or if they've finalized candidates, but we should hear something about that before the legislative session. Charlie, do you know how soon that would happen?
I'm not sure exactly when, but I do know that, Achilles ran last year in a fairly crowded primary against people like Nixon Matthews, who I know has said he's, not happy with what Achilles has done here. So maybe he's going to run again. And I live in District 16, so I'm looking forward to see who they come up with.
Need a reset or just a chance to slow down? Trade the traffic and to-do lists for a glass of wine and an open sky at Walla Walla. Just a scenic 4-hour drive from Boise, this peaceful destination in the heart of the Pacific Northwest offers a true escape from your hectic schedule. You'll have the opportunity to wander through more than 130 wineries nestled among golden hills and vineyards, and then cozy up in a tasting room. You can stroll through the charming historic downtown by day, and at night, dine al fresco on meals made by celebrated chefs from fresh ingredients grown just down the road on local farms. Come discover why Walla Walla is one of the Pacific Northwest's best-kept secrets. You don't have to go far to feel far away. Plan your getaway at wallawalla.org today.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast Gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast Gems.
Charlie, this really was the perfect week to have you on because another topic that I wanted us to talk about is Boise and their red light cameras. And from where I'm sitting, this feels like another issue where the Idaho legislature, the Republican legislature, the party of small government, is telling Boise what it can and can't do. Is that a fair stance? I sometimes I make some generalizations. Is that a fair stance?
It does kind of feel like every time we talk, Lindsay, the legislature has done something new that prevents Boise from making its own laws about things. This is a broadly speaking another example of what we call state preemption, which is basically the power of in this case, a state legislature to basically limit the authority of local governments like cities, like counties, to regulate certain things or make law around certain things. So basically state law overrides or supersedes local laws on a particular subject. So we saw this, we've seen this a couple different areas this year. Certainly, we've talked a lot about the flag business, the state basically saying there are only these certain kind of flags you can fly. We saw this with the mask mandates, basically the state outlawing mask mandates and making it so that cities and towns can't enforce their own mask mandates. And so, this is kind of another example where last October, the Boise City Council unanimously approved an agreement with ACHD to start a pilot program enforcing red light cameras within the city limits. So basically, these cameras at red lights that can take a picture of your license plate if they see that you have blown through a red light. And then they can automatically send you a bill for the infraction, right? So taking, patrol cars out of the equation here, trying to lighten some of that burden. And then the Idaho legislature came in and basically said, you can't use them for that, and limited the ways in which you can use those red light cameras.
Okay, Charlie, at one point in my life, I was a libertarian. I don't even know who she was, but libertarian Lindsay still lives in my brain sometimes. And the perspective that I had when I was libertarian on this was, well, it's a victimless crime, and it's an unobserved crime. And it's, if nothing happened, if there was no accident, if nothing happened, then, whoops, it's not great, but it's not, it's not an issue that's breaking down society. And if it wasn't observed, is it really okay to send a ticket, to prosecute, to move forward with this? So I'm curious what
yeah, if a car blows through a red light in the forest, does anybody
care? Yeah.
I think so. I care on this. And that's because someone blows through a red light and a car does not happen to be coming in the other direction. So there's no accident. But a lot of other times there are. And so what the law says is that you basically can't use these cameras unless an accident happens, and then you need to go back and look through evidence and things like that. But this is, it's kind of the same way we think about preventative medicine, right? Why have preventative medicine if you're never going to get sick? Well, because sometimes you catch something early on that does end up getting you really sick. And so in this case, this is trying to create a culture of safe driving through these enforcement mechanisms, right? To me, that sort of argument is like, well, I'm a good driver, and so I should be allowed to drive as fast as I want. But that's not how laws work, right? We cater to the lowest common denominator to try to protect society. And so in this situation, I think it's one where you're trying to catch bad behavior before it really starts and catches on so that it doesn't cause an accident. And the city has said, and Mayor McLean said, that they had observed a serious increase in pedestrian deaths and hit and run accidents and things like that. And so this is a way of trying to nip a situation in the bud so that you don't have to have these accidents down the road.
Absolutely. Well, and it's one of those things where, someone could say, well, I've accidentally blown through red lights 5 or 6 times. Nothing's ever happened. But then the time it does, you could kill somebody. Like it's the weight of the risk versus what happens or what could happen is very high. If I know that a camera could catch me. And so even if I'm like, oh, I can make it, like, I'm much less likely to take that risk if I know that I could get a ticket. Like, I don't know if other people don't feel that way, but I definitely be like, yeah, it's fine. I'll stop at the yellow. It's okay.
No, it's intended to be a deterrent so that this is something you're thinking about as you're thinking about whether you want to run that red light. And it's these kinds of situations, you can't prove the fatalities you didn't cause, right? But you can show over time that if you have more people just following these laws, then you're going to have fewer accidents like that. And I also, I say this as someone who bikes a lot on Boise's roadways, like pretty frequently, and have observed cars driving really dangerously or acting like I don't exist when I'm following the rules or blowing through red lights. A patrol vehicle, with the police is not likely to always be catching all that kinds of stuff. And so this is also, like, for all the talk about government efficiency, this is a way to make things way more efficient, to have police officers out maybe doing more important things that they've been trained for rather than just sort of, sitting and watching red lights, right? This is, I get the concerns about, invasion of privacy and things like that. But I also sort of feel like, all of us use our phones and the internet every day, and we're subject to like massive corporate surveillance just to sell us stuff. But if the government that we actually elected wants us to use one camera to make sure we don't run red lights with impunity, like, then that's a huge problem. So that's a little bit of a thing I have an issue with too.
Yeah. Does the city of Boise have any recourse? Can they challenge this? Is there, kind of like the flag law where, it's not a great written bill. There's no enforcement mechanism. Is there anything that Boise can do to kind of assert its authority and say, like, hey, we're having these fatalities, we're having these issues. We want to be able to govern our city where we live. Hey, you legislators from other parts of the state, we're going to do what we need to do.
In this case, the legislative language is pretty clear about what it can and can't be used for. And the city has said, look, this is the law. And so, for now, anyway, it looks like we are a red light on the red light cameras.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
To start off our picks of the week, I actually have a pick that is brought to you by Visit Walla Walla. And their pick of the week is an epic night of music under the stars with Alison Krauss and Union Station, featuring Jerry Douglas, plus special guest Willie Watson. You can catch all of the fun and music on Tuesday, July 22nd at the Wine Country Amphitheater in Walla Walla. Now, doors open at 6 p.m. There will be food, drinks will be flowing at the venue, so you can sip, snack, and sway to soulful sounds in Washington's scenic wine country. I feel like this sounds like ultimate summer night vibes. Tickets start at just $72.50, and you can get all the details at winecountryconcerts.com.
Alison Krauss is one of my absolute favorites, and Jerry Douglas is amazing too. Literally, I was thinking about going to this, but I can't go. Yeah, I swear to God. So no, I'm so excited for people who are able to go, and I'm also just an unabashed Walla Walla fan. Like I said at the top of the pod, great wine, great situation. So
any chance you can go to Walla Walla, it's not that far, and it does feel like you're getting away. So I'm a big fan of Walla Walla
for sure.
Well, Charlie, what is your pick of the week this week?
Yeah, so my pick of the week is it's very summer themed. It's a farm called Peaceful Belly Farm out in Caldwell. My wife and I are members of their CSA, which is Community Supported Agriculture, and so this is a very common thing. It's where a farm gets sort of the huge amount of seasonal fruit and veggies, produce that they grow. They get it out directly to consumers who are interested in supporting the farm, and so each week we have a pickup point just up the street off of Hill Road, and we get, a really nice bunch of produce each week. It also has this sort of huge added environmental benefit, right? You're not like flying in or trucking in way out of season fruit and veg from other climates. And so instead, you can support local growers, reduce the environmental impact, and have the freshest possible produce for the stuff we make at home.
Okay, so what's something you've gotten recently that you like wouldn't go to the grocery store and be like, this is what I'm buying, but what did you get that was maybe unusual or different? And then what did you do with it?
Yeah, I'm going to say the Swiss chard. Like we made a couple salads. First of all, sometimes like they get so much of a particular thing, you're like, how am I ever going to have this much chard? And so, we made a nice summer salad with it, and we had a ton left over, and I started throwing it in my smoothies.
Hey.
It was really, really nice way to make my smoothies a little bit healthier. So that's a really good one. I also want to like shout out one other thing I really love about Peaceful Belly, which is they have out in Caldwell at their farm a cidery and cafe on the property, and it's just a really, really stunning place. You can get some dinner, sip some cider. You can just walk around the farm and enjoy the scenery. They also have farm to fork dinners. They have great stuff for kids too, kids cooking and artistry camps. It's just like one of my true, real happy places I go to in the Treasure Valley.
Charlie, I had no idea about that. I didn't know that they had the restaurant. Okay, that's been flying under the radar for me. I need to go check that out. Thank you for making that a pick of the week, because I had no idea, and now I'm like furiously taking notes because
it's so good.
I want to go check it out.
It's a bit of a drive, but it's worth the drive. It's so, so good.
Okay, my pick of the week is I was, going through the news, combing through it, looking for stories for our Friday episode. And Boise Dev had an article that they are going to be publishing a book, Incredible Idaho Women, 43 Inspiring Stories for All Ages. And they talked about how they had gone to Sun Valley, seen a statue about a Boise Olympian who was a woman and had no idea who that was, didn't know anything about her. Her name was Gretchen Fraser. And so they decided they needed to have this book about Idaho women's stories because they are severely underrepresented in all of history. I'm actually currently reading Uncredited by Allison Tyra, which is about women's overlooked, misattributed, and stolen work. And it's a fantastic book. I also recommend that book, but it's so enraging. I have to just read it in little bits because it's over 600 instances of disregarded women or overlooked or, purposefully forgotten stories about what women have done in our society. And one of the stats that just, when I can't sleep at night, this just like pops into my head is that in history books, less than 3% of stories are about women, even though they make up 51% of the population. And so once I saw that Boise Dev is going to be having this book, I was so excited because I'll admit, if you asked me to name 5 influential Idaho women that aren't like current legislators, I don't know if I can. And that's not okay. I don't feel okay with that. So I am so glad that they are writing this book.
I saw this in the Boise Dev newsletter as well, and I'm really excited about it. First of all, I love this like intelligent, informed Lindsay version of hate watching television, except instead you're just hate reading about these. But it's really important because, we can't, like in thinking about now and what's next, the next young women who are going to do amazing things, it's important to see examples of that in history to know that even in this really tough time, this was possible and it's even more possible now. So that's something we know is super important. And so I'm really excited about this too. I can't wait to get my hands on it.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing your expertise into these very politically charged issues. Thank you so much for your pick of the week. I'm definitely going to be heading there. And once again, thank you for joining us on CityCast Boise.
Always a pleasure, Lindsay. See you next time.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. The show is produced by Evelyn Avitia, Frankie Barnhill, and me, Lindsay Van Allen. Blake Hunter writes our Hey Boise newsletter with help this week from Francisco Kilgore and Adrian Gonzalez. Our music is by Up Is the Down Is The and All the Kimonos. If you enjoyed our show today, leave us a review. It helps other people find us. We'll be back on Monday to find out more about why Buc-ee's has such a cult following and if Meridian is ready for it. You won't want to miss it.